Trong Tin Hung Disi beat. I had barely made it home from surgery when my daughter-in-law looked me in the eye and said, "Stop being dramatic and cook, you old hag." For a moment, I thought I had misheard her, that the lingering fog from anesthesia was playing tricks on me. But the silence that followed told me I hadn't, because my son Daniel didn't say a word. He just sat there at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone like nothing unusual had happened, like his mother hadn't just been reduced to something small and disposable right in front of him. And I stood there in the doorway, one hand still resting against the wall for support, the other pressed gently against the bandage beneath my sweater, feeling the dull ache that reminded me I was supposed to be resting, supposed to be recovering, supposed to be cared for, not standing in a house I had kept running for over 30 years being told to make dinner as if I were a burden that had overstayed its welcome. And I remember noticing the smell of something slightly burnt on the stove, a pot left unattended, the kind of thing I would have never allowed when this was still my kitchen, when everything had its place and purpose, when my husband Thomas used to sit at that same table and smile at me as I moved around the room, telling me to take it easy even when I insisted I was fine. And for a second, just a second, I almost said something back, almost reminded her that I had just been discharged that morning, that the doctor had specifically told me no lifting, no standing for long periods, no stress. But instead I swallowed the words before they could leave my mouth, because something in her tone, in the way she didn't even look away after saying it, told me this wasn't frustration or a bad day. This was something deeper, something that had been waiting for the right moment to surface. And maybe that moment had been my weakness, my absence, the brief window where I wasn't here to see what was changing around me. And I slowly walked past her without responding, each step careful, measured, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me stumble, even though my body wanted to, even though the pain pulsed quietly beneath the surface. And as I reached the stove, I turned the burner down and stirred the pot, not because I intended to obey her, but because I needed a second to think, to understand how things had shifted so far without me noticing, how my home had started to feel like a place where I needed permission to exist. And that was when I smiled, just slightly, not enough for either of them to question it, but enough for me to feel it settle inside my chest, because in that moment, standing there with a wooden spoon in my hand and silence pressing in from all sides, I realized something they clearly hadn't considered. They thought I was too weak to notice what was happening, too tired to question it, too broken to respond, and they were very, very wrong. I did not finish cooking that night. Not really. I just moved through the motions long enough to keep everything from burning, long enough to make it seem like nothing had happened. And when the plates were set down on the table, I did not sit with them. I quietly turned off the kitchen light and made my way upstairs, one slow step at a time, holding onto the railing because the weakness in my body had not gone away just because I had decided not to show it. And when I reached my bedroom, I closed the door behind me and leaned against it for a moment, listening to the muffled sound of their voices downstairs, low and casual, as if the evening had unfolded exactly as it should have, as if I were no longer part of the picture they were building together. And that was when I began to notice the small things, the details that had been easy to overlook before, but now felt impossible to ignore. My dresser drawer was slightly open, just enough to catch my attention, and when I walked over and pulled it out, I saw that the stack of documents I always kept neatly arranged had been disturbed, the edges no longer aligned. One envelope turned the wrong way, another shifted to the side, and for a second I simply stared at it, trying to convince myself that maybe I had done it before I left for the hospital, that maybe it was nothing, but deep down I knew I would not have left it like that, not after a lifetime of keeping my things in order. And I sat down carefully on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping beneath me, the familiar scent of lavender from the linen spray still lingering in the air. But even that comfort felt distant now, like something from a different version of this house. And I opened the envelope that had been moved, my hands steady despite the quiet tension building inside me. And inside were copies of documents I had not taken out in years, property records, insurance information, and something else, something new, a printed page I did not recognize at first glance, until I looked closer and saw my name typed neatly at the top, followed by language that made my chest tighten, references to long-term care options, asset evaluations, phrases that sounded polite on the surface but carried a weight I could not ignore. and I let the paper rest in my lap as the realization settled in slowly, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a puzzle I had not known I was solving. This was not about one cruel sentence at dinner. This was not about impatience or insensitivity. This was planning, careful and quiet, done while I was away, done when I was vulnerable. And I thought back to the days before my surgery, to the way Melissa had suddenly become attentive, asking questions about my appointments, about my medications, about where I kept certain files, and at the time I had told myself it was concern, that maybe she was trying to be helpful in her own way, but now those moments felt different, like rehearsals for something larger, something that required me to be out of the way long enough for them to move things around without interruption, and I could feel the shift happening inside me. Not anger, not yet, but something colder, something clearer, a quiet understanding that I had been looking at my life through the wrong lens, that what I thought was distance or indifference might actually be something more deliberate. And I folded the paper carefully and placed it back exactly where I had found it, aligning every edge the way it had been before, because if they were watching, if they were waiting to see whether I would notice, I was not going to give them that answer. Not yet. And as I lay back against the pillows, the dull ache in my body still there, I stared up at the ceiling and listened to the house settle into the night. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the soft murmur of voices that did not call for me. And for the first time since I had come home, I understood something that made it impossible to sleep. I was not recovering in this house. I was being positioned within it, and the difference between those two things would change everything. I woke up earlier than usual the next morning, not because I felt rested, but because something inside me refused to let me sleep any longer, and for a few seconds I lay there still, staring at the faint morning light coming through the curtains, listening to the quiet hum of the house, as if I were trying to learn it all over again, as if I needed to understand how everything worked now that I had seen what I was not supposed to see. And when I finally sat up, the stiffness in my body reminded me of the surgery, a dull pull across my side that made every movement deliberate. But it was not the physical discomfort that stayed with me. It was the awareness, the kind that settles quietly but does not leave. And I moved slowly to the bathroom, pausing when I noticed something else that felt just slightly off. The cabinet door beneath the sink was not closed all the way, and inside, the small box where I kept my medications had been shifted forward, as if someone had checked it recently. And I reached down and opened it, counting the bottles out of habit, one by one, noting nothing missing, nothing obviously wrong. But the arrangement was different, and that was enough, because it meant someone had been here, someone had been going through things that did not belong to them. And I straightened up carefully, closing the cabinet exactly as I found it. My reflection in the mirror looking back at me with a calm I did not entirely feel. And as I made my way downstairs, the smell of coffee greeted me, fresh and strong. But it was not for me. I could tell by the way only one mug sat on the counter, already half empty, and Daniel stood by the sink with his back to me, his posture stiff in a way that told me he knew I was there before I said anything. And when he finally turned, he offered a small nod instead of a smile, a gesture that felt more like acknowledgement than affection, and I asked him how he slept, my voice even, as if we were still the same two people we had always been, but he answered quickly, too quickly, saying he had an early call and could not talk long, and there was something rehearsed about it, something that made it clear this distance was not accidental. And before I could respond, Melissa walked into the kitchen, her expression composed, her tone light as she commented on how I should not be on my feet too much. The same person who had ordered me to cook the night before now speaking, as if she were concerned. And the shift was so smooth it might have convinced someone who had not been paying attention. But I had, and I noticed the way her eyes flicked briefly toward the hallway where my bedroom was, then back to me, measuring, calculating, and I nodded, playing along, because that was what I needed to do now. And as they moved around the kitchen, speaking about errands and appointments, I listened more than I spoke, catching fragments of sentences that did not quite connect, references to paperwork, to timelines, to things that were not explained but clearly understood between them. And at one point Melissa mentioned needing to follow up on that estimate. And Daniel responded with a quiet, not yet, a phrase that lingered in the air longer than it should have. And I turned my attention to the window, watching the early morning light stretch across the backyard, remembering how Thomas used to stand there with his coffee, talking about the garden, about small things that mattered because they were ours, and I realized then how different this felt, how everything now seemed to move around me instead of with me, as if I were no longer part of the rhythm of this house, but an obstacle within it, something to be managed. And when Daniel picked up his keys and left without another word, and Melissa followed shortly after, reminding me to rest in that same carefully pleasant tone, the front door closing behind them with a soft click that echoed through the quiet. I remained where I was, standing in the middle of the kitchen, letting the silence settle, and only then did I allow myself to exhale fully, because the pieces were no longer scattered, they were beginning to form a pattern, and whatever they were planning, whatever they thought they were preparing me for, it was already in motion, and now so was I. The house stayed quiet longer than I expected, the kind of quiet that feels heavier when you know it is not natural, when you know it has been created by absence rather than peace. And I moved slowly through it, not out of caution for my body this time, but out of a need to see, to confirm, to understand what had changed while I was gone. And I found myself drawn to the hallway closet where Thomas used to keep his old toolbox, the one he insisted on holding onto even after we no longer needed it, saying it was not about the tools but about having something reliable within reach. And I opened the door and saw that it had been pushed to the side, not removed, just shifted enough to make room for a stack of boxes I did not recognize, plain cardboard, neatly taped, labeled in handwriting that was not mine. And I crouched slightly, feeling the pull in my side, and read one of the labels, kitchen items. Another said seasonal decor, and there was something about that phrasing that made my chest tighten, because those were not just things, they were pieces of a life I had built over decades, reduced to categories that could be packed and moved without thought. And I stood there for a moment, letting that realization settle, before closing the door gently and continuing down the hall. And as I passed the living room, I noticed the photographs on the mantel had been rearranged, not drastically, but enough that the older ones, the ones from before Melissa came into our lives, had been pushed slightly to the side, replaced by newer frames, brighter, more polished. And I stepped closer, picking one up, a picture of Daniel and me from years ago, taken in the backyard on a summer afternoon, both of us laughing, his arm around my shoulders. And I remembered the way he used to look at me back then, with a kind of easy warmth that did not need to be questioned. And I set the frame back down exactly where I found it, aligning it carefully with the others, because that was what I did now. I restored things to their positions so no one would know I had noticed. And as I moved toward the front room, my mind drifted back to the days before the surgery, to the way Melissa had hovered just enough to seem attentive, offering to help organize my papers, asking where I kept certain records, suggesting that it might be easier if everything were streamlined, a word she used more than once. And at the time I had smiled and told her there was no need, that I had my system, that everything was where it needed to be, and she had nodded, agreeable, patient. But now that patience felt different in my memory, less like kindness and more like waiting, and I could see it clearly now, the pattern forming across moments I had once dismissed, the questions, the glances, the quiet conversations that stopped when I entered the room. And I walked into the dining area and placed my hand on the back of one of the chairs, feeling the smooth wood beneath my fingers, remembering the countless meals shared there, the holidays, the birthdays, the ordinary evenings that felt meaningful simply because we were together. And I realized how carefully that history had been set aside, not erased, but repositioned. Like everything else in this house, shifted just enough to make space for something new, something that did not include me in the same way. And I straightened up slowly, taking a measured breath. And in that moment, the uncertainty that had followed me since I came home began to settle into something steadier, not fear, not confusion, but clarity, because this was not happening around me by accident. It was being done with intention, piece by piece. And if they believed I would remain still while it unfolded, if they believed I would quietly accept whatever role they had decided for me, then they had misunderstood something fundamental, not just about me, but about everything I had built within these walls. And as I turned away from the dining room and headed back toward the staircase, I understood that whatever came next would not be determined by their plans alone, because now I had begun to see the whole picture. And once you see something clearly, it becomes impossible to pretend you do not. By mid-afternoon, the house had settled into that same artificial stillness, but this time I did not move through it as someone trying to understand what had changed. I moved through it as someone looking for confirmation, and I found it sooner than I expected, not in a hidden drawer or a misplaced document, but in something far simpler, something almost careless, a notification sound coming from the study. A room Melissa rarely used unless she needed privacy, and I paused just outside the doorway, not out of hesitation but out of instinct, listening to the faint echo of a voice through the partially closed door, her voice, low and controlled, the way it always was when she thought she was being discreet, and I did not catch every word, but I caught enough, phrases like timeline, valuation, and something that made my hand tighten slightly against the wall. She will not be able to manage much longer. And there was a pause, then a softer tone, almost reassuring. No, everything is already being organized. And I stood there without moving, not because I was shocked, but because I was no longer surprised. And that realization was more telling than anything else, because it meant that somewhere between the hospital room and this hallway, I had already accepted the possibility that this was happening, that I was no longer imagining it. And I stepped back quietly before the conversation could shift, returning to the kitchen with the same measured pace I had adopted since coming home. And I poured myself a glass of water, watching the way the light caught the surface as it filled, steady, controlled, predictable, everything that the rest of this situation was not. And when Melissa finally emerged from the study, her expression was composed, her movements unhurried. She greeted me with that same practiced politeness, asking if I needed anything, if I was feeling all right, and I nodded, matching her tone, because there was no reason to confront her. Not yet, and she seemed satisfied with that, turning her attention to her phone, scrolling, typing, continuing whatever process she had set in motion. And I realized then that this was not just about removing me from the house. It was about doing it in a way that appeared reasonable, structured, even beneficial, a narrative that could be explained to others without raising questions. And that required preparation, documentation, a sequence of steps that would make everything look inevitable. And I finished my water and set the glass down gently on the counter, my mind already moving ahead, not in panic, not in fear, but in quiet calculation, because if there was a timeline, then there was also a starting point. And if there was a starting point, then there were moments before it, moments that had not been accounted for. And I turned slightly, glancing toward the hallway where the study door now stood open, the space inside looking ordinary again, as if nothing had been said there at all. And I understood something then that settled deeper than any of the suspicions before it. They were not just acting without me. They were acting around me, assuming I would remain exactly where they had placed me, unaware, compliant, and fading into the background of decisions that no longer included me. And for the first time since I came home, I allowed myself to feel something close to resolve, not loud, not dramatic, but firm, because whatever they believed about my condition, whatever conclusions they had drawn from my absence, they had overlooked one simple truth. I was still here, still thinking, still capable of seeing the spaces between their words and actions. And if they were building a plan step by step, then so would I. Only mine would not rely on their assumptions. And as I turned away from the counter and made my way back upstairs, each step steady despite the lingering ache, I knew that the next time Melissa spoke to someone behind a closed door, it would not be the only conversation shaping what happened next. That evening, I did something I had not done in years. I closed my bedroom door, sat at the small desk by the window, and reached for the phone not to call family, not to check in, but to reconnect with someone who existed outside the quiet arrangement forming within these walls. And for a moment, I simply held it in my hand, remembering the last time I had spoken to Grace Bennett, how her voice had filled the space between us with warmth and honesty, the kind that does not ask for permission to be real. And I dialed her number slowly, listening to each tone as it rang, wondering if I was overreacting, if I was letting a few scattered details build into something larger than it needed to be. But when she answered, her voice steady and familiar, those doubts faded almost immediately, because there are some people who hear what you are not saying. And Grace had always been one of them. And I told her I had just come home from surgery, that things felt different, not wrong in a way I could easily explain, but shifted. And there was a pause on the line, not of confusion, but of recognition. And she asked me one simple question: had anyone been going through your paperwork while you were gone? And I closed my eyes for a second, the answer already forming before I spoke it. Yes. and she let out a slow breath, the kind that carries understanding rather than surprise. And she told me something that settled deeper than anything I had pieced together on my own. She said that when people begin organizing someone else's life without being asked, it is rarely about helping. It is about preparing, and the word landed with a clarity that removed any remaining doubt. Preparing, not assisting, not supporting, but arranging outcomes in advance. And I leaned back in the chair, the wood pressing gently against my spine, and asked her what that meant in practical terms, and she did not hesitate. She said it usually meant they were gathering information, assessing assets, creating a timeline that would justify decisions later, decisions that would be presented as necessary rather than chosen. And as she spoke, each piece aligned with what I had already seen, the documents, the boxes, the conversations behind closed doors. And for the first time since this began, I did not feel alone in my understanding of it, because someone else saw it too, someone who had nothing to gain from being right except the truth itself. And I asked her what I should do, not in a way that expected immediate answers, but in a way that acknowledged I could not remain passive, and she was quiet for a moment before responding, choosing her words carefully, and when she spoke again, her voice carried that same calm certainty I remembered. She said the first thing you do is you do not let them know you have seen anything. You let them continue exactly as they are, because people reveal more when they believe they are not being watched. And I nodded even though she could not see me, because that was already what I had begun to do, and she continued, saying the second thing is you find out exactly what is in your name. What has been set in place before now, not what they tell you, but what is documented. And I felt a small shift inside me at that, a recognition that there were parts of this story that existed beyond what was happening in this house, things Thomas had arranged, things I had trusted would remain untouched, and Grace suggested I speak with Mr. Collins, the attorney who had handled our affairs for years, someone who would know the structure of everything without relying on assumptions. And as she said his name, I felt something settle into place, not relief, not yet, but direction, a path that did not depend on guessing. And when we ended the call, I did not sit there wondering what to think anymore. I stood up slowly, the ache still present but no longer defining, and I walked to the dresser, opening the drawer with the same careful movement as before, but this time not to check for disruption, but to take out what I needed, because whatever plan was unfolding around me, it was no longer the only one in motion. The next morning, I moved with intention rather than hesitation, not rushing, not drawing attention, but no longer drifting through the house as if I were uncertain of my place in it. And after they left, after the front door closed and their voices faded into the distance, I waited a few minutes longer than necessary, just enough to ensure I would not be interrupted, and then I picked up the phone again, this time dialing a number I had not needed to use in years but had never forgotten. And when Mr. Collins answered, his voice measured and professional, I introduced myself not as someone asking for help, but as someone verifying what already belonged to her, and there was a brief pause before recognition settled in, and his tone shifted slightly, warmer, respectful, the way it used to be when Thomas and I would sit across from him discussing plans for the future, plans that now felt more relevant than ever. And I explained that I had recently returned home after a medical procedure and wanted to review the documents associated with the house, the accounts, everything that had been structured under Thomas's guidance. And he did not question the timing. He did not ask why now. He simply said that everything was on file and that he could walk me through it whenever I was ready. And I told him I was ready now. And as he began to speak, outlining the details with the clarity of someone who understood both the legal and the personal weight of what he was describing, I felt something inside me steady itself, because this was not speculation. This was structure. This was the foundation that had been built long before anyone thought they could rearrange it. And he explained that the house remained fully in my name, protected by specific provisions that required my direct consent for any transfer or sale, and that no secondary party could initiate changes without my approval. And I listened carefully, not interrupting, letting each word settle, because it confirmed what Grace had suggested, that there were safeguards in place, not obvious to those who assumed they could operate freely. And when I asked about any recent inquiries or requests related to my property, there was another pause, slightly longer this time. And he said there had been a preliminary call, not from me, but from someone identifying themselves as a family member seeking general information about care options and asset evaluations. And he did not need to say the name for me to understand who it had been, and I thanked him, keeping my voice even, asking him to make a note that no decisions were to be discussed or processed without speaking directly to me, and he agreed. Without hesitation, and when the call ended, I remained standing in the quiet of my room, the phone still in my hand, not because I was unsure, but because I was absorbing what had just shifted, because now I knew something they did not. I knew where the boundaries were, and more importantly, I knew they could not move them without my participation, and that knowledge did not make me feel triumphant. It made me precise, because it meant I no longer had to react. I could choose when and how to respond, and I set the phone down carefully on the dresser, smoothing the edge of the papers beside it, aligning them with the same attention I had given everything else. And when I looked up at my reflection, I did not see someone recovering. I saw someone who had stepped back into awareness, someone who understood that silence was not weakness but positioning. And as I turned toward the door, hearing the faint sound of a car pulling into the driveway earlier than expected, I knew that whatever came next would not catch me unprepared, because while they had been planning around me, I had begun planning within the truth of what was already mine. When the front door opened earlier than usual, I did not rush to greet them. I remained exactly where I was, standing near the dresser, my posture relaxed, my expression neutral, because there was no longer any need to anticipate their movements. And when their voices carried up the stairs, lower than normal, sharper at the edges, I recognized something immediately. Tension, not directed at me yet, but present between them. And I stepped out into the hallway, just as Melissa passed by, her pace quicker than before, her phone still in her hand, and she stopped for a fraction of a second when she saw me, not startled, but measuring, adjusting, and her tone when she spoke was different, less polished, more controlled, as if she were recalibrating, asking if I needed anything, reminding me again to rest. But this time there was an undercurrent to it, something that suggested she was no longer entirely certain of her footing, and I nodded, keeping everything simple, because there was power, now in not offering more than necessary, and Daniel followed behind her, slower, his expression unsettled in a way I had not seen before, and for a brief moment, our eyes met, and there was something there, not quite guilt, not quite awareness, but something close enough to both that it held, and then it passed, replaced by the same distance he had been maintaining, and he moved past me without speaking, heading into the study, closing the door behind him more firmly than usual, and I continued down the hallway, not toward them, but toward the kitchen, because routine was now part of the structure I was maintaining, and as I filled a glass with water, I listened without appearing to listen, the faint murmur of their voices filtering through the walls, less careful now, less contained, and I caught fragments again, questions this time, not statements, Daniel asking something in a low voice, Melissa responding quickly, defensively, and though I could not hear every word, the tone told me enough. Something had shifted, something had interrupted the smooth progression of whatever they had planned, and I leaned lightly against the counter, letting that realization settle, because it meant the call to Mr. Collins had not gone unnoticed, not directly, but in its effects, in the way information had not come back to them the way they expected, in the way their timeline had encountered resistance they had not anticipated, and after a few minutes, the study door opened, and their voices stopped immediately, replaced by silence that was too deliberate to be natural, and Melissa entered the kitchen again, her movements slower now, more cautious, and she watched me for a second longer than necessary before speaking, asking if I had spoken to anyone today, the question casual on the surface, but precise underneath, and I met her gaze without hesitation, answering simply that I had checked in with an old friend, nothing more, nothing less, and she held my eyes for a moment, searching for something, perhaps a sign, perhaps confirmation, but I gave her nothing beyond what I had said, and she smiled, but it did not reach her eyes this time, and she turned away, reaching for a cabinet she had already opened earlier, repeating a motion without purpose, and in that small detail, I saw it clearly, uncertainty, not about what they wanted, but about whether they still controlled how it would unfold, and Daniel did not come into the kitchen again. He remained in the study, the door closed, the quiet inside heavier than before, and I finished my water and set the glass down gently, my movements steady, deliberate, because there was no need to rush, no need to confront, not yet. And as I turned to leave the room, I understood something that changed the way the air itself felt. In that house, they had begun this believing I would not notice. And now they were continuing without knowing how much I had already seen, and that difference, that single shift in awareness, was enough to alter everything that came next.